Aria stood at the altar, staring at the man she was being forced to marry, and thought, this cannot be real life. She wanted to scream. She wanted to faint. The man before her looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts at a horror movie warehouse. His face was a nightmare of twisted scars and sagging skin. Aria was only 22, an ambitious designer, but she was sacrificing her soul to marry this creature, to pay off her mother's crushing medical bills. As the preacher announced the kiss, Aria closed her eyes tight, praying for strength. His lips were dry, cracked, and cold as a corpse. But what Aria didn't know was that this crusty old man was a lie. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was Marcello, the city's most feared mafia boss, hiding behind a hyperrealistic mask. And when that mask finally comes off, the nightmare turns into a power struggle that will have you screaming at your screen. Stick around, because this plot twist is going to knock you clean off your chair. Aria stood in their cramped Atlanta apartment, the hum of the old refrigerator the only soundtrack to her best broke life. She had just graduated with a graphic design degree, but her current reality consisted of freelancing for peanuts and prayers while the job market remained cold. Across the room, her mother, Sophia, was a ghost of her former self. As a nurse's aide, Sophia pulled double shifts that left her bone-tired, her face etched with new worry lines from the $60,000 in medical debt that threatened to swallow them whole. They were drowning, but they were together, until the door swung open and a bad penny named Vincenzo walked back into their lives. Aria's father had been MIA for 20 years, a deadbeat whose return felt like a fresh bruise. He didn't come with an apology, he came with a pitch. "I've arranged a marriage for you, baby girl," he announced with a grin that made Aria's skin crawl. He described the groom, Marcello, as a wealthy, prestigious man who needed a wife for legal reasons. The price for Aria's hand? A cool $250,000 in cash. Absolutely not, Aria fired back, her pride flared. But Vincenzo was a predator who knew exactly where to strike. He pointed at Sophia, reminding them both that they were suffocating under the weight of their loans and unpaid bills. Aria looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw a woman who was killing herself just to keep the lights on. The choice was a jagged pill, but Aria swallowed it. "I'll do it," she whispered, her mind spinning with the logic of survival. She told herself it was just temporary, a bizarre business transaction that would buy her mother's freedom. She imagined living in a nice house for a year or two and then walking away set for life. What she didn't know, what no one dared tell her, was that she wasn't just marrying a reclusive billionaire. She had just been sold to a man the underworld whispered about in terrified tones, a man they called the Ghost. The music started, and Aria's steps faltered as she entered the tiny, desolate chapel. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the terrifying uncertainty of the man waiting at the end of the aisle. She had expected wealth, perhaps even coldness, but she was not ready for the nightmare standing before her. Marcello, or the version of him presented to the world, looked like a Halloween decoration that had been left in the rain for 3 years too many. His face was a disaster of sagging skin and deep scars that looked like melted wax, draped over a frame so twisted he had to lean heavily on a weathered wooden cane just to stay upright. He was old, carbon-dated old, and he trembled slightly as he watched her approach. When she finally reached the altar, Aria felt the air leave her lungs. Marcello turned to her with watery, clouded eyes and offered a greeting. "Hello, Aria," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel being chewed in a blender. It was a sound that made her skin crawl, yet she forced herself to stand still, repeating the mantra of her mother's medical bills in her head to keep from fleeing the room. The ceremony was a blur of hollow words and suffocating silence. When the preacher asked for her vows, Aria's brain screamed for her to run, to fake a heart attack, to do anything but commit to this life. But she thought of her mother's exhaustion and choked out an "I do" that felt like a death sentence for her soul. Then came the kiss. Marcello leaned in, his breath smelling of ancient cheese, and when his lips finally brushed hers, they were dry, cracked, and as cold as a corpse. Her stomach lurched in a wave of pure, visceral disgust. The moment the papers were signed, the brief illusion of a family event evaporated. Her father, Vincenzo, appeared at her side just long enough to hand her a thick envelope of cash, the first installment of her sale. With a wink and a hollow "congratulations," he vanished through the chapel doors along with the few witnesses, leaving Aria standing in the heavy silence. She was officially alone with a man who looked like death's ugly cousin, bound to a stranger whose true face remained hidden behind a mask of decay. Aria followed Marcello out of the chapel, her footsteps heavy with the weight of the cash-filled envelope in her bag. She expected a getaway in a beat-up sedan, but she froze when she saw a driver in a crisp, black suit holding open the door of a literal Rolls-Royce. "This is yours," she whispered, her eyes bugging out at the sheer opulence of the vehicle. Marcello merely nodded as he settled into the leather seat with a pained grunt. "One of them," he rasped casually, as if owning a fleet of luxury cars was as common as owning a pair of shoes. As the car glided through the city, the neighborhoods shifted from the struggling blocks Aria knew to streets lined with obscene wealth. They finally pulled up to a mansion that looked like it belonged to royalty, a cathedral of stone and glass that made Aria's brain short-circuit. Inside, the gilded cage was even more intimidating. Everything was marble, from the floors that echoed her squeaking sneakers to the grand staircase. Chandeliers hung from the ceilings like frozen explosions of light, likely costing more than her entire college education, while the art on the walls looked like it had been stolen from a museum. Marcello leaned heavily on his cane, his breathing ragged as he led her upstairs. He stopped before a door that opened into a bedroom 3 times the size of her old apartment. "This is your room," he said, his voice gentle despite the gravelly rasp. "I'm down the hall. We'll have separate spaces." I won't impose on you." Aria stood in the center of the plush carpet, unsure how to respond to such unexpected boundaries. Marcello paused in the doorway, his hunched frame casting a long, twisted shadow. "I know this isn't what you wanted," he admitted, the resignation in his voice cutting through the air. "I know you married me for money. I'm not naive. But look at me, the only way a man like me gets a wife is by paying for 1 inch." He shuffled away before Aria could find her voice, leaving her alone in the silence of her new, beautiful prison. She had expected a monster, someone who would treat her like the property her father had sold, but instead, she felt a confusing surge of guilt. Beneath the frightening mask of scars and decay, there was a man who seemed to have made peace with his own loneliness, and for the first time, Aria wondered if the most dangerous thing in this house wasn't Marcello, but the secret he was keeping. Over the next few days, a natural pattern developed in the quiet luxury of the mansion. Every morning, Aria would find Marcello already at the breakfast table, hunched over his newspaper and drinking coffee. In the unforgiving daylight, his discolored, papery skin and deep scars looked even worse, but Aria forced herself to sit with him. To her surprise, he didn't just ignore her, he asked about her life, her dreams, and her design work with genuine interest. Aria soon discovered that her husband was actually hilarious. One night, while they watched a cooking show together, a chef spoke pretentiously about deconstructed cuisine. Marcello let out a sarcastic rasp, remarking that deconstructed was just a fancy word for not finishing a meal, and joked that he'd soon be served hydrogen and oxygen in separate glasses as deconstructed water. Aria laughed so hard she snorted, realizing that his wit was as sharp as his appearance was dull. Unlike many men she had encountered, Marcello treated her with profound respect. He valued her opinions, and they would engage in passionate, 20-minute debates about everything from philosophy to why pineapple on pizza was a crime against humanity. He didn't just listen, he took action to support her career. After looking at her freelance rates, he told her she was drastically undercharging and used his elite network to connect her with high-paying clients. Within a week, she had more lucrative projects than she had ever dreamed of. Aria realized with a start that she was actually catching feelings for him, not for the monster she saw, but for the man who saw her so clearly. However, the comfort of their routine was shattered when she visited his study to deliver some papers. On his desk sat a photo of a gorgeous young man in his prime, tall and fit with a confident smile. Marcello quickly claimed it was his nephew, a successful tech mogul he rarely saw, but Aria couldn't look away. The young man in the photo had the exact same piercing eyes as Marcelo, the same shape, the same color, and the same terrifying intensity. Around 2 a.m., Aria gave up on sleep and decided to get some water. As she passed Marcelo's room, she froze. She heard a voice coming from inside, but it wasn't his usual gravelly rasp. It was deeper, smoother, and completely devoid of the age she had grown used to. "I know," the voice said with a heavy sense of anguish, "every day it gets harder to maintain this act." Aria's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the man she had been falling for was performing a character. Driven by a need for the truth, she waited until the voices went silent and the house was still. Her hands shook as she pushed open his door, which had been left unlocked. In the moonlight streaming through the window, she saw him asleep, but it was his dresser that stopped her breath. It was covered in professional-grade theatrical makeup, spirit gum, and prosthetic pieces that were perfect replicas of aged, scarred skin. Aria moved closer to the bed, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. In the pale light, she noticed something she had missed before. One of the jagged scars on his cheek looked slightly off, peeling at the very edge. Her hand moved on its own. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and caught the loose edge of the prosthetic. Heart pounding, she carefully began to peel it away, revealing smooth, perfect skin underneath. Suddenly, Marcelo's eyes snapped open. They stared at each other for a frozen, terrifying moment before he sat up. There was no shakiness, no cane, and no hunched posture. In the moonlight, with half the prosthetics removed, Aria saw a face that was young, muscular, and devastatingly handsome, the man from the photo on his desk. "I'm still me," he said, his real voice deep and desperate. "Please let me explain." But Aria was already backing away, the fake scar falling from her shaking hand. The man who stood before her was a powerful stranger in his prime, and she realized with a jolt of terror that her entire marriage had been a lie from the very first day. Marcelo ran a hand over his real face, young and unlined, letting out a long, desperate breath. "5 years ago," he began, his voice now a smooth, serious baritone, "I was engaged to a woman named Bianca." He explained how he had overheard her at a party, laughing about how she was only with him for the Marcelo fortune and planned to cheat on him with her personal trainer the moment they were married. The betrayal had left him cold, convinced that every woman who looked at him only saw a bank account with a mediocre personality attached. Driven by a need to know if anyone could love the man beneath the money, he used his old theater training to construct the old man disguise. He had spent weeks mastering the prosthetics and the gravelly rasp, creating a character so undesirable that only someone looking for a soul would stay. But it wasn't just an experiment, it was a race against time. He revealed that he was a powerful mogul with deep ties to the city's underworld, and his grandfather had left him the entire empire with one condition: he had to be married within 5 years, or the legacy would fall to his cousin Luciano, a man Marcelo described as a complete snake. "I thought you'd be just another gold digger I could keep at arm's length," Marcelo admitted, taking a step toward Aria with his real eyes open and vulnerable. "But you weren't. You were kind when you had every reason to be disgusted. You defended me when I was nothing but a burden." His voice dropped to a whisper as he made his confession. "I fell in love with you, Aria, because you saw past the mask when I thought I had nothing left to give." Aria stood frozen, her mind a chaotic blur of emotions. She looked at this breathtaking stranger and heard the same soul she had spent weeks growing to cherish, yet the magnitude of the lie felt like a physical weight. She had started to fall for the old man with the kind heart, but she didn't know if she could ever truly trust the Mafia king who had manipulated her from the start. As the first light of dawn began to creep into the room, she realized she was caught between the man she thought she knew and the dangerous stranger who now held her heart. Determined to start over, Marcelo took Aria on a real date, no disguises, no lies, and no gravelly voice. As they sat in a small restaurant, the connection between them felt electric, a bridge finally being built between the man she had loved in the shadows and the handsome mogul sitting across from her. However, the evening was shattered when a stunning woman approached their table with a sneer of pure disdain. It was Bianca, the ex-fiancée whose betrayal had driven Marcelo into hiding. Bianca didn't hold back, looking Aria up and down before labeling her a nobody and a gold digger who wasn't of the proper caliber for a Marcello. But Bianca hadn't accounted for the fire that years of struggling had forged in Aria. Standing her ground, Aria calmly reminded Bianca that while she might not be rich, she actually cared for Marcello as a person, unlike a woman who only dated for a bank account and planned to cheat on her husband. The room went silent as Aria dismantled Bianca's ego, leaving the socialite flushed with rage and Marcello watching his wife with a look of intense admiration. The triumph was short-lived. Marcello's phone rang, and the voice on the other end was cold. It was his cousin, Luciano. He delivered a chilling message. Aria's deadbeat father, Vincenzo, was threatening to go to the media with the full story of the marriage arrangement. Vincenzo was demanding another $500,000 to keep quiet, effectively blackmailing the man who had already saved his daughter. Aria felt a wave of crushing humiliation wash over her. Her father wasn't just a deadbeat, he was an extortionist, using her as a weapon to bleed her husband dry. "My dad is blackmailing you," she whispered, her face burning with shame. Marcello tried to reassure her, but before he could finish his sentence, both of their phones buzzed in unison with a breaking news alert. The story had already leaked. The headline painted Aria as a manipulative fraud who had seduced a billionaire for his fortune, and the media was already descending like vultures. The world now saw her as the very thing Marcello had spent years trying to avoid, and the nightmare was only beginning. Marcello refused to let a blackmailer dictate the terms of their lives, choosing instead to own the story by calling for a massive press conference to set the record straight. However, just as they prepared to face the firing squad of reporters, a final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Marcello realized that his own cousin, Luciano, had been the one pulling the strings from the beginning, conspiring with Aria's father to ensure the marriage, and Marcello's reputation collapsed. Stepping out onto the stage, Aria was nearly blinded by the relentless flashes of dozens of cameras. Marcello gripped her hand, grounding her as he spoke into the microphones with a voice that was no longer a rasp, but a commanding baritone. He admitted to the world that while their union began as a cold business transaction to satisfy a will, it had evolved into something undeniably real. He told the sea of cynical faces that he had fallen in love with Aria not because of an obligation, but because she was the only person who saw his soul when he thought he had nothing left to offer. Then, Aria took the mic. Her voice shook at first, but she found her strength as she looked directly into the lenses. She told her truth, that she had walked down that aisle as a desperate woman trying to save her mother from a mountain of medical debt. She admitted she expected to endure a nightmare, but instead found a man who treated her with more dignity and respect than anyone she had ever known. "I love him," she said, her voice clear and resonant, "and I'd choose him 1,000 times over, even if he had nothing." The shocking payoff came when Marcello reached out and pulled Aria into a passionate, unscripted kiss right there on the stage. The room erupted. The crowd that had arrived to jeer a gold digger was suddenly swept up in a wave of cheers. But as they broke apart, breathless and triumphant, Marcello's head of security rushed toward them, his face pale. A silent alert flashed on the monitors. Aria's father, Vincenzo, had just been spotted at the mansion gates, and he wasn't there to negotiate, he was armed with a gun. The adrenaline from the press conference was still coursing through Aria's veins when they reached the mansion, only to find the gates breached. Vincenzo was already inside the foyer, looking agitated and desperate, his face twisted with a rage that bordered on madness. He wasn't there to reconcile. He began screaming that Marcello was merely using Aria for a clause in a dead man's will, claiming he would throw her away like trash the moment his inheritance was secure. Vincenzo demanded $500,000 to stay quiet, but Marcello didn't flinch. Standing firmly between Aria and her father, Marcello delivered a blow Vincenzo never expected. He announced that his reputation, his business, and his money meant nothing compared to Aria. He was willing to lose the entire empire just to keep her safe, a choice that left Vincenzo stunned and speechless. The standoff ended when Marcello's security team and the police moved in. As they took Vincenzo into custody, Marcello revealed he hadn't been idle. His lawyers had compiled a massive file on Vincenzo's crimes, from tax evasion and fraud to embezzlement. He made it clear that while Vincenzo had come to destroy them, he was the one who would be spending a long time behind bars. Aria watched as the man who had sold her was led away in handcuffs, feeling a profound sense of relief that the monster from her past was finally silenced. But Vincenzo wasn't the only snake Marcello had to deal with. He turned his attention to his cousin Luciano, the man who had facilitated the entire betrayal to steal the family legacy. Marcello moved with ruthless efficiency, removing Luciano from Marcello Enterprises and stripping him of his shares entirely. He made it official: Luciano was no longer family, and he was banned from the empire for good. With the air finally cleared of the people who had tried to tear them apart, the mansion felt like a home for the first time. Marcello took Aria's hands in his real eyes filled with an intensity that made her breath catch. He didn't want their life together to be defined by a business arrangement or a desperate sacrifice. He looked at her and asked the only thing that mattered now. He wanted her to marry him again, with a real wedding and their family present, choosing each other the right way. 2 weeks later, the Marcello estate was transformed into a cathedral of light for a ceremony that was finally real. Aria stood in the garden, wearing a gown she had chosen for herself, surrounded by fairy lights and the people who truly cared. In the front row, Sophia sat with a radiant smile, healthy and happy, watching her daughter finally walk toward a future that wasn't a transaction. When Aria reached the altar, she didn't see a billionaire or a mob boss. She saw the man whose intelligent, kind eyes had anchored her from the very beginning. Their vows were a testament to the journey that had nearly broken them. Marcello admitted with a thick voice that while he thought he was the one testing Aria, she had been the one testing him, challenging him to be more honest, more vulnerable, and more real than he had ever dared to be. Aria, her eyes shimmering with happy tears, confessed that she had married a man she thought was one thing, only to discover someone completely different. She realized then that the package didn't matter. What mattered was the beautiful heart she had discovered beneath the layers of deception. 3 years later, the world looked entirely different. Aria was now the successful CEO of her own design firm, a business that had exploded in the wake of their viral love story. She sat in her sunlight-drenched office, finishing a major rebrand, when Marcello appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. Their life was no longer a series of hidden secrets, but a partnership of best friends. Later that evening, they stood in the nursery watching their son, Neil, named after the grandfather who had started it all, sleep peacefully in his crib. As they stood together, Aria shared one final secret. "I think I started falling for you when you were still in disguise," she admitted with a smile. She confessed that the pizza topping debate was the moment she forgot to be scared and realized she had found someone who truly saw her. Marcello laughed, holding her close, as they reflected on the strange road that had led them here. The final lesson was clear to both of them: true love isn't about appearances, status, or bank accounts. It is about the courage to stay in the light and the rare, beautiful gift of finding the person who sees your soul and loves you for exactly who you are. And that is the lesson from Aria and Marcello's story. True love isn't about what someone looks like, how much money they have, or the power they wield. It's about finding the one person who sees your soul and loves you for exactly who you are, even when you're wearing a mask. Aria walked into a nightmare arrangement and came out with a beautiful love story because she had the heart to see deeper than the surface. Marcello thought he had to hide his face to find the truth, but he learned that the right person will always find you in the dark. So, here's my question for you: if you were in Aria's shoes, would you have stayed to find the man behind the mask, or would you have run the moment you saw that old man at the altar? Drop your theory in the comments. I'll be hearting the best responses. If this story touched your heart, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. I drop 2 new stories every week, and trust me, you do not want to miss the next plot twist. Give this video a thumbs up if you believe in true love, and tell me in the comments what kind of story you want to see next. Thanks for watching, and remember, never judge a book by its cover, or a groom by his mask.